If you want to pull off the ultimate, legally bulletproof revenge against the people who systematically destroyed your family, you need to understand one absolute, unwavering rule. Revenge is not a crime of passion. It is a ledger. It is a meticulously calculated equation of assets, liabilities, and above all else, an ironclad paper trail. My tragedy didn't begin with a sudden accident. It began with the slow, deliberate, and agonizing theft of my marriage and my children by a man whose arrogance was only matched by his bank account. My ex-wife and her wealthy new husband thought they had entirely broken me, assuming I would just quietly fade into the background of my own ruined life as a defeated, humiliated spectator. But what they failed to realize was that while they were busy spending my money and laughing at my expense, I was quietly constructing a financial guillotine. And the most unexpected, beautiful part of my story isn't just that the blade finally dropped. It's that when their entire world was violently incinerated, I was 2,000 miles away, casually eating pancakes, with a receipt to prove it. The dull, constant hum of the Boeing 777 engines had been vibrating through my skull for what felt like a lifetime. I was on the final leg of a grueling, 20-hour journey from Singapore, with a soul-crushing layover in Taipei, descending finally through the thick, gray clouds toward Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. I was flying business class, surrounded by plush leather, complimentary champagne, and the quiet murmur of international executives, but it felt little better than a cattle car. Exhaustion had seeped into my very bones, settling deep in my joints and making my eyes burn. I rested my forehead against the cool acrylic of the window, watching the sprawling grid of the Chicago suburbs materialize through the mist. It was exactly 7:45 a.m. locally, and ironically, it was my birthday. There were no balloons waiting for me at baggage claim, no cheerful messages lighting up my phone, and certainly no loving wife waiting to greet me at the arrival's terminal. Birthdays used to be a massive, chaotic affair in my household. I used to wake up to the smell of burnt toast and the sound of my two teenage kids, Liam and Chloe, arguing over who got to carry the unevenly frosted cake into the bedroom. But those mornings felt like a distant, faded movie I had watched in another lifetime. Today, the only gift I was giving myself was the quiet, brutal satisfaction of closure. The aftermath of my divorce from Sarah had been nothing short of a massacre. After 15 years of marriage, she hadn't just left me. She had discarded me with a cold, breathtaking efficiency for a man named Miller. Miller was a wealthy, manipulative hedge fund manager who viewed people as commodities to be acquired and liquidated at his convenience. He didn't just want Sarah. He wanted to completely erase me from my own life. Using his bottomless legal fund, he had dragged me through a humiliating, scorched-earth divorce proceeding, legally bleeding me dry while Sarah sat beside him, intoxicated by his arrogant displays of wealth. They took the house, they took the lion's share of my savings, and they poisoned the well with my kids, treating me like a pathetic, temporary inconvenience whenever it was my weekend for visitation. To survive the sheer, suffocating humiliation of it all, I had thrown myself entirely into my work. As a senior financial consultant, I had readily accepted a massive, 4-month international assignment in Singapore. My friends and colleagues thought I was running away to lick my wounds in Southeast Asia, hiding from the painful reality of Sarah and Miller parading their new, glamorous life around our social circles. Let them think that. Let Miller think he had won. The distance provided the perfect, impenetrable cover for the financial trap I had been slowly, meticulously setting for the last 8 months. Miller thought he was a titan of industry, but his wealth was built on a fragile house of cards, heavily leveraged on shady debts and offshore liabilities. I knew the numbers. I knew his weak points. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into Chicago," the captain's voice crackled through the cabin intercom, pulling me back to the present. I unbuckled my seatbelt slightly, reaching into my jacket pocket to feel the smooth plastic of my itinerary folder. My pulse began to beat a slow, steady rhythm of pure adrenaline. As the landing gear deployed with a heavy mechanical thud beneath me, I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Today was the day. The trap I had laid halfway across the world was primed. The detonator was in place, and all that was left was for me to establish the most flawless, undeniable alibi ever recorded. I wasn't just returning to America. I was stepping onto the stage for the performance of a lifetime. The exhausted, defeated ex-husband was dead. The man stepping off this plane was an architect of absolute ruin, and I was about to execute my masterpiece. The terminal at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport was a labyrinth of scuffed linoleum, harsh fluorescent lighting, and the hurried, anxious energy of thousands of travelers moving blindly toward their destinations. Stepping off the Boeing 777 after a 20-hour transit from Singapore felt like wading through deep water. My legs were heavy, my spine ached from the confined business-class seat, and my internal clock was screaming at me that it was the middle of the night, despite the weak morning sunlight filtering through the massive glass windows. It was 8:30 a.m. locally, and the sprawling city of Chicago was just waking up. I, on the other hand, had not slept a wink. But fatigue was a luxury I could not afford today. When you are orchestrating the total, absolute financial ruin of a man like Miller, there is zero margin for error. Miller was a creature of the legal system, a man who paid teams of aggressive corporate lawyers hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to shield him from consequence and crush his adversaries. If he even caught a slight breeze of the catastrophe that was about to hit him, he would immediately look for a scapegoat. He would look for me. Therefore, I needed to be a ghost in his narrative, completely untethered from the impending explosion. I needed a paper trail so dense, so verified, and so meticulously recorded that no judge, investigator, or lawyer could ever place me anywhere near the crime scene. I breezed through customs with the practiced ease of a frequent international traveler, offering the border agent a polite, exhausted smile. I made sure to look directly into the overhead security camera as I handed over my passport, ensuring my face was captured in high definition with a corresponding digital timestamp from the federal government. Footprint number 1. Outside, the brutal chill of a Chicago April morning hit me like a physical blow. The wind was whipping off Lake Michigan, carrying a damp, biting cold that instantly cut through my tailored suit jacket. I bypassed the rideshare apps, too anonymous, too easily manipulated, and walked directly to the official taxi rank. I slid into the back of a yellow cab, giving the driver the address for the Chicago Sheraton Suites Hotel. "Rough flight, buddy," the driver asked, glancing at me through the rearview mirror as we merged onto the Kennedy Expressway. "Singapore to Taipei, then straight here," I replied, intentionally making conversation. I wanted him to remember the exhausted businessman in the back seat. 20 hours in the air. I think my brain is still somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. "Oof, welcome back to the freezing cold. You here for business or pleasure?" "Just business," I said, a dark, silent smile playing on my lips as I looked out at the gray skyline approaching in the distance. "Closing a very important account today." When we arrived at the Sheraton, I didn't pay with cash. I pulled out my personal American Express card, swiped it through the machine, and waited for the printed receipt. Footprint number 2. I grabbed my luggage and walked into the warm, bustling lobby of the hotel. I had booked the room 2 nights prior, ensuring it would be ready for an early morning check-in. The clerk at the front desk was a young man with a neat name tag that read Marcus. I approached him, dropped my bags with a heavy, dramatic sigh, and handed over my credit card and driver's license. "David, checking in," I said. "I know I'm incredibly early, but I booked it for the previous night so I could get straight in. I just flew in from Singapore and I am desperate for a shower." "Of course, sir, I see the reservation right here," Marcus said, typing rapidly on his keyboard. "Room 1412, it's fully prepped and ready for you." "Thank you, Marcus." "Quick question, what time does the fitness center open? I need to force myself to stay awake so I don't completely ruin my circadian rhythm. If I go to sleep now, I'll miss my meetings." "It's open 24 hours, sir. Your room key will grant you access on the 3rd floor." "Perfect, you're a lifesaver." I took the key card, making sure to smile and hold eye contact. I was establishing myself as a living, breathing entity in this specific geographic location. Footprint number 3. When I reached room 1412, the temptation to collapse onto the pristine, king-sized bed was overwhelming. The crisp white linen seemed to be actively calling my name, promising a temporary escape from the physical agony of jet lag. But I didn't even sit down. I dropped my heavy leather duffel bag onto the luggage rack, unzipped it, and immediately pulled out my gym clothes. 10 minutes later, I was on the 3rd floor, swiping my keycard against the electronic lock of the fitness center. The green light flashed, logging my entry into the hotel's digital security mainframe. Footprint number 4. The gym was mostly empty, save for a businessman walking lazily on an elliptical in the corner. I walked over to the free weights, grabbed a pair of 30-pound dumbbells, and began to lift. As the physical burn started to build in my muscles, my mind inevitably drifted back to the catalyst for all of this. I thought about the day Sarah had casually slid the divorce papers across our kitchen island, looking at me not with anger, but with an agonizing, dismissive pity. I thought about Miller, sitting in the courtroom in his bespoke Italian suits, smirking as his lawyers systematically dismantled my finances, claiming a larger share of my own assets to fund their new life together. They had felt so untouchable. They had assumed my quiet, pragmatic nature was a sign of weakness. But my pragmatism was exactly what had allowed me to see through Miller's facade. Over the past 8 months, while sitting alone in a sterile corporate apartment in Singapore, I had dug into the digital architecture of Miller's hedge fund. I utilized back channels, offshore data registries, and quiet conversations with people Miller had previously crushed. I discovered that his empire was built entirely on illegal, highly leveraged shadow loans. He was moving dirty money to cover legitimate losses, essentially running a high-stakes corporate Ponzi scheme. I didn't hack him. I didn't steal anything. I simply gathered the raw, irrefutable data, packaged it perfectly, and set an automated, encrypted program to anonymously deliver the entire dossier to the SEC, the IRS, and his largest, most ruthless investors. And the trigger for that automated delivery had been set for exactly 9:00 a.m. Central Standard Time. Today, I dropped the weights with a heavy clatter and moved to the treadmills. I set the incline to a steep grade, cranked the speed, and forced myself to run. I ran until my lungs burned, until the sweat was pouring down my face, completely soaking my shirt. I ran to purge the exhaustion from my body, and I ran to purge the last lingering ghosts of my marriage from my mind. Every footfall on the rubber belt was a rhythmic countdown to their destruction. By the time I hit the 30-minute mark, my legs were trembling, but my mind was sharper and clearer than it had been in years. I wiped down the machine, swiped my keycard to exit the gym, footprint number 5, and returned to my room. I stripped off my soaked gym clothes and stepped into the shower. I turned the handle completely to the right, bypassing the hot water entirely, and stood directly beneath the showerhead as freezing, icy water blasted over my skin. The shock was absolute and visceral. The freezing water felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing my flesh, forcing a sharp, involuntary gasp from my lungs. My heart rate skyrocketed, my muscles contracting violently as my body desperately tried to generate heat. I stood there, leaning my forearms against the cold tile wall, letting the freezing deluge wash over my head and down my back. I didn't step out. I endured it for a full 15 minutes, letting the ice-cold temperature systematically obliterate every single trace of the 20-hour flight. When I finally turned the water off and stepped onto the bath mat, my skin was flushed red and my teeth were chattering violently. But as I grabbed a towel and looked at myself in the fogged-up mirror, the exhaustion in my eyes was completely gone. I was vibrating with a fierce electric energy. I dried off, shaved, and pulled a fresh, impeccably pressed suit from my garment bag. I tied my tie with precise, deliberate movements, checking my reflection one last time. I looked like a man ready to conquer the world, not a man who had just flown across it. I strapped my watch to my wrist and checked the time. It was 9:45 a.m. The automated dossier had been delivered 45 minutes ago. At this exact moment, federal agents were likely walking into Miller's glass-paneled corner office. His phones would be ringing off the hook, his investors would be freezing his accounts, and the terrifying realization that his entire life was imploding would finally be dawning on him. Sarah would be waking up in their sprawling mansion, completely unaware that the wealth she had traded our family for was already gone. And me? I was in Chicago, establishing my alibi and preparing to head downstairs. I had a massive appetite, a crucial appointment at a private bank to finalize, and an overwhelming desire for a large plate of pancakes. The trap had successfully snapped shut, and I was exactly where I needed to be. The elevator ride down from the 14th floor was a quiet, seamless glide that felt profoundly symbolic. I watched the illuminated numbers tick backward on the digital display above the doors, listening to the soft, instrumental jazz piped into the stainless steel cabin. I was entirely alone, dressed in a charcoal gray tailored suit, a freshly pressed stark-white shirt, and a crimson silk tie. The freezing 15-minute shower had worked a miraculous alchemy on my biology. The bone-deep, 20-hour exhaustion of my flight from Singapore had been temporarily overwritten by a potent cocktail of adrenaline, caffeine anticipation, and the quiet, thrilling hum of impending victory. I stepped out of the elevator and into the bustling, expansive lobby of the Chicago Sheraton Suites. The atmosphere was a chaotic symphony of morning corporate life. Bellhops pushed brass luggage carts over plush carpets, concierges rapidly typed on their keyboards behind the polished granite front desk, and dozens of business professionals milled about, clutching briefcases and checking their expensive watches. I blended perfectly into the scenery. To anyone looking, I was just another traveling executive preparing for another mundane day of endless quarterly reports and boardroom negotiations. They had absolutely no idea that I was currently the architect of a multi-million-dollar demolition. I made my way across the lobby toward the hotel's primary restaurant. The rich, intoxicating aroma of roasting espresso beans, sizzling bacon, and melted butter hit me before I even reached the hostess stand. For the last 4 months in Southeast Asia, I had lived on a diet of dim sum, laksa, Hainanese chicken rice, and heavily spiced curries. While the food in Singapore was undeniably spectacular right now, my body was experiencing a violent primal craving for the heavy, unapologetic comfort of a classic American breakfast. "Good morning, sir," the hostess smiled warmly, grabbing a leather-bound menu. "Just one for breakfast this morning." "Just me," I nodded, returning the smile. "If you have a booth near a window, I'd greatly appreciate it. I've been out of the country for a while, and I just want to watch the city wake up." "Of course, right this way." She led me to a comfortable, curved leather booth tucked into the far corner of the dining room. It offered a sweeping, cinematic view of the busy Chicago street outside, where pedestrians were hurrying along the sidewalks, their collars pulled up against the biting April wind. I slid into the booth, sinking into the plush leather. A waitress named Clara appeared moments later with a silver carafe of coffee. "Coffee to start, hun." "Clara, you are about to become my favorite person in the entire city," I told her, flipping my coffee cup upright so she could pour. "I will likely drink 4 cups of that before I leave this table. I also know exactly what I want to order." I didn't hold back. I ordered a towering stack of buttermilk pancakes, a massive side of scrambled eggs, 4 strips of extra crispy bacon, and 2 link sausages. Clara chuckled as she wrote it down, clearly amused by the sheer volume of food requested by a single man in a tailored suit, and hurried off to put the ticket into the kitchen. As I sat there, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic of my coffee mug and taking that first glorious, scalding sip of black coffee, I glanced down at my watch. It was 9:55 a.m. The encrypted, highly classified financial dossier I had programmed in Singapore had been sitting in the inboxes of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the Internal Ethics Board of Miller's largest institutional investors for nearly an hour. I leaned my head back against the booth, closed my eyes, and allowed myself the profound, psychological luxury of a split-screen reality. While I was sitting in a warm, comfortable booth in Chicago, listening to the gentle clinking of silverware and the soft hum of morning conversation, I knew exactly what was happening in Miller's sprawling, glass-paneled corner office back home. The grace period of ignorance was over. I pictured the scene with vivid, high-definition clarity. I imagined the sudden, terrifying sound of the heavy wooden doors of his firm swinging open. I pictured a half-dozen federal agents in dark windbreakers bearing yellow block lettering marching past the frantic, protesting secretaries. Miller would be sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, perhaps leaning back in his ergonomic leather chair, barking arrogant orders into his headset. He would look up, entirely annoyed by the intrusion, completely unprepared for the reality that the shadow loans and illegal offshore asset leveraging he had used to fund his empire had been completely, forensically exposed. I took another slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter, roasted flavor on my tongue. Miller's entire sense of self-worth was intrinsically tied to his perception of his own untouchable brilliance. He genuinely believed that the laws of finance, the same laws he had weaponized against me during the divorce, did not apply to him. But the dossier I had compiled left zero room for interpretation. It contained the routing numbers, the Cayman Island shell accounts, the falsified tax depreciations, and the exact timestamps of every illegal wire transfer he had authorized over the last 3 years. By the time the clock struck 10:00 a.m., his corporate bank accounts would be entirely frozen by federal mandate. His phone lines would be seized. The wealthy elite investors who treated him like a financial god would be frantically pulling their capital, triggering a catastrophic run on his hedge fund that he could not possibly cover. And then there was Sarah. My ex-wife had walked away from 15 years of marriage, destroying our family unit without shedding a single tear, because Miller had offered her an immediate, seamless transition into a life of staggering luxury. She had traded the quiet, dependable stability of our life for country club memberships, private jets, and black card shopping sprees. I pictured Sarah at this exact moment. It was mid-morning. She was likely walking out of a high-end Pilates class or sitting at an exclusive patio cafe with her new, equally wealthy socialite friends, ordering mimosas. I imagined her casually handing her titanium credit card to a waiter, entirely oblivious to the massive financial earthquake leveling her husband's office across town. I pictured the waiter returning, looking awkward and apologetic, politely informing her that the card had been declined. She would scoff, assuming it was a bank error. She would pull out a second card, declined, then a third, declined. The realization would hit her like a bucket of ice water. The impenetrable fortress of wealth she had sold her soul to inhabit was actively collapsing around her, trapping her inside the rubble. "Here we are, hun," Clara's voice broke through my incredibly satisfying daydream. I opened my eyes and smiled as she set a massive, steaming plate of food down in front of me. The pancakes were thick and golden brown, crowned with a melting square of butter. The bacon was perfectly blistered, the eggs fluffy and steaming. She topped off my coffee mug, cup number 2, and left a small glass pitcher of warm maple syrup on the table. "Thank you, Clara. This is exactly what I needed." I ate with a slow, methodical appreciation. Every single bite of that breakfast tasted like pure, unadulterated justice. I was ravenous, the physical toll of the flight finally demanding calories, and I cleared the entire plate over the next 20 minutes. I poured the syrup, I ate the bacon, and I drank 2 more cups of black coffee until my veins were practically humming with caffeine. I wasn't a monster. I hadn't fabricated any evidence against Miller. I hadn't framed him for a crime he didn't commit. I had simply turned on the lights in the dark room where he operated. I had forced the universe to balance its own ledger, and yet the satisfaction I felt as I wiped my mouth with the linen napkin was profound. I caught Clara's eye and gestured for the check. She walked over, handed me the black leather folio, and smiled. "Everything tastes okay." "It was the best breakfast I've had in a year," I told her honestly. I opened the folio. The bill was substantial for a single breakfast, but it was irrelevant. I reached into my wallet, bypassed the cash, and deliberately pulled out my personal American Express card. I handed it to Clara, waiting patiently as she walked over to the point-of-sale terminal at the hostess stand. She returned a minute later with the printed receipt. I uncapped my pen, left a massive, generous tip on the tip line, and signed my name with a flourish. But before I closed the folio, I looked closely at the top right corner of the printed merchant slip. Date, April 14th. Time, 10:14 a.m. Footprint number 6. I had a physical, digitally verified receipt proving that at the exact moment Miller's hedge fund was being raided by federal authorities, and his entire life was being dismantled piece by piece, I was sitting in a hotel restaurant 2,000 miles away, leisurely paying for a side of Link sausages and 4 cups of coffee. My alibi was now entirely bulletproof. I stood up, slid into my tailored suit jacket, and buttoned the center button. I walked out of the restaurant, crossing the bustling lobby with a confident, purposeful stride. The automatic glass doors slid open, and the freezing, biting wind of the Chicago morning hit my face, but I barely felt the cold. I raised a hand, hailing a passing yellow cab. It pulled up to the curb, and I climbed into the back seat. "Where to, boss?" The driver asked. "J.P. Morgan," I said, glancing at my watch. It was 10:18 a.m. on Dearborn Avenue. I have a 10:30 appointment on the 8th floor. The cab merged into the heavy downtown traffic, carrying me away from my perfect alibi and toward the private banking suites. The trap had been successfully sprung, but the game wasn't entirely over. It was time to secure my own empire. The cab navigated the congested, gridlocked arteries of downtown Chicago, the towering skyscrapers of the Loop creating a man-made canyon of glass, steel, and shadow. I sat in the back seat, watching the city blur past the rain-streaked window, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. The frantic, desperate energy that usually accompanied a high-stakes financial maneuver was entirely absent. I wasn't scrambling to assemble a plan. I was simply arriving to witness its inevitable, flawless execution. The taxi pulled up to the curb on Dearborn Avenue, stopping directly in front of the monumental stone facade of the J.P. Morgan Chase building. The architecture was imposing, designed to project absolute permanence and unshakable institutional power. I paid the driver, tipped him generously, and stepped out into the biting wind. Pushing through the heavy brass revolving doors, I instantly traded the chaotic, freezing roar of the city for the hushed, climate-controlled serenity of extreme wealth. The lobby smelled faintly of polished marble, expensive leather, and old money. I approached the private security desk, bypassed the long lines of everyday retail banking customers, and presented my identification to the stern-faced guard. He checked my name against a digital manifest, nodded respectfully, and escorted me to a private, wood-paneled elevator tucked away in a discreet alcove. He inserted a specialized keycard into the panel and pressed the button for the 8th floor. The 8th floor of this particular branch was not a place where people opened checking accounts or applied for standard mortgages. It was the private wealth management suite, a heavily fortified financial sanctuary reserved exclusively for high-net-worth individuals, corporate liquidators, and international asset managers. It was where empires were quietly built, and occasionally where they were ruthlessly dismantled. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a sprawling, immaculate reception area bathed in warm, recessed lighting. Before I could even approach the desk, a tall, impeccably dressed man in a navy pinstripe suit stepped out of a glass-walled conference room to greet me. "David," he said, extending a hand with a crisp, professional smile. "Welcome back to Chicago. I trust your flight from Singapore was tolerable." "It was long, Thomas, but entirely worth the trip," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. Thomas Sterling was a senior private wealth director. He was sharp, utterly discreet, and possessed a mind that viewed global finance as a high-stakes chessboard. Over the past 8 months, while I was exiled in Southeast Asia, Thomas had been my proxy, the quiet executor of my incredibly complex financial restructuring. "Come on back to my office," Thomas offered, gesturing down the hallway. "Can I get you anything? Coffee, sparkling water?" "I've hit my caffeine quota for the morning, thank you," I said, following him into his massive corner office. The room featured panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, a heavy mahogany desk, and a large flat-screen television mounted silently on the far wall, permanently tuned to CNBC's financial news feed. I took a seat in one of the plush leather chairs opposite his desk and set my briefcase on the floor. "Do we have the final transfer documents prepared?" "Everything is ready for your signature," Thomas confirmed, taking his seat and opening a thick leather-bound portfolio. "But before we execute, I have to admit, David, I've been reviewing the architecture of these transfers all week, and it is a masterpiece. Terrifying, but a masterpiece." I offered a small, cold smile. Thomas didn't know the personal, vindictive nature of my divorce, nor did he know the name Miller. He only knew the numbers, the corporate entities, and the incredibly toxic asset structure I was currently disarming. But to a seasoned banker, the numbers told a story all on their own. To understand the absolute genius of the trap I had laid, you have to understand the arrogance of the man who stole my life. During my brutal, scorched-earth divorce, Miller's high-priced lawyers had relentlessly pursued my most visible, high-yield assets. They wanted my lucrative commercial real estate portfolio, a holding company that generated massive quarterly dividends. I had put up a desperate, theatrical fight in the courtroom, begging the judge not to let them take it, pretending it was my crown jewel. In the end, to settle the divorce and appease his own massive ego, Miller absorbed the holding company, folding it directly into his own hedge fund's capital to inflate his leverage. Sarah had smirked at me across the settlement table, entirely convinced they had bled me dry. But my frantic courtroom resistance was a carefully orchestrated performance. What Miller's lawyers failed to realize in their sheer, unadulterated greed was that I had spent the preceding 6 months quietly restructuring that specific holding company. I had bound it to a series of heavily convoluted, cross-collateralized shadow debts. Debts that featured catastrophic balloon payments and immediate margin calls if the parent hedge fund ever triggered a federal audit. I had essentially gift-wrapped a ticking financial time bomb, disguised it as a golden goose, and handed it directly to the man who ruined my marriage. "By signing these final divestiture forms today," Thomas explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses, "you are completely, permanently severing your last remaining legal and financial tethers to the original holding company. Your pristine capital, the pure, unleveraged assets you shifted offshore, will be officially repatriated into your private trust here at J.P. Morgan. You will be entirely insulated. And the toxic liabilities attached to the real estate portfolio." I asked, wanting to hear him confirm it out loud. "They remain legally binding to the current primary stakeholder," Thomas said, tapping his expensive pen against the portfolio, "which, according to the divorce settlement records, is the acquiring hedge fund. If that fund ever faces a liquidity crisis or, God forbid, a federal freeze, the debt covenants on that real estate portfolio will trigger instantly. The current owner won't just lose the asset. They will be held personally, unconditionally liable for the balloon payments. It would bankrupt them overnight. Then let's not waste another minute, I said, reaching into my jacket for my fountain pen. Thomas slid the heavy stack of documents across the mahogany desk. I took my time, reading every single page, savoring the crisp sound of the paper turning in the quiet office. With every signature I placed on the dotted lines, I was legally severing myself from the wreckage of my past. I was building an impenetrable financial fortress around my own future, while simultaneously locking the door on Miller and Sarah's burning house. I signed the final page, capped my pen, and pushed the portfolio back toward Thomas. "Excellent," Thomas nodded, immediately turning to his dual-monitor computer to input the authorization codes. "I am initiating the wire transfers now." The funds from the Singapore Shell accounts are moving, clearing international holds, and they are officially secured in your private trust. As Thomas spoke, a sudden flash of bright, urgent red on the mounted television screen caught my eye. I turned my head. The silent CNBC broadcast had abruptly cut away from its standard market analysis. A massive breaking news banner was scrolling rapidly across the bottom of the screen. The camera showed a live, chaotic feed of a familiar downtown office building, Miller's corporate headquarters. "Thomas," I said quietly, pointing at the screen. "Turn the volume up." Thomas frowned, grabbed the remote from his desk, and unmuted the television. The frantic voice of the financial anchor filled the office. "We are getting live reports of a massive, coordinated federal raid currently underway at the headquarters of one of the city's most prominent hedge funds. Sources inside the Securities and Exchange Commission confirm that they, along with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, have completely locked down the building and frozen all associated corporate accounts." The broadcast cut to a close-up shot of the building's glass doors. Two federal agents in windbreakers were physically escorting a man out of the lobby. His hands were zip-tied behind his back, his expensive bespoke Italian suit wrinkled and disheveled. His face was pale, his arrogant smirk entirely erased, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. It was Miller. Insiders are reporting that an anonymous, highly detailed forensic dossier was delivered to federal authorities early this morning, exposing hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent offshore shadow loans and illegal asset leveraging. The fund is currently experiencing a catastrophic liquidity crisis, and trading has been permanently halted. Thomas stopped typing. He slowly lowered his hands from his keyboard, staring at the television screen, and then slowly turned his head to look at me. The realization of what had just transpired in his office was dawning on him in real time. He looked at the signed divestiture documents on his desk, and then back at the television, recognizing that the exact catastrophic trigger event we had just discussed was unfolding on live national television. "David," Thomas whispered, his voice laced with a mixture of profound shock and deep professional reverence. "Did you know this was going to happen?" I leaned back in the plush leather chair, crossing my legs, my eyes never leaving the television screen as Miller was unceremoniously shoved into the back of a federal vehicle. "I've been in Singapore for the last 4 months, Thomas," I replied, my voice smooth, calm, and entirely innocent. "I was on a 20-hour flight all night, and I spent my morning eating pancakes in the hotel lobby. I have the receipts to prove it." "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about." Thomas swallowed hard, a slow, understanding smile spreading across his face. He recognized the brilliance of the alibi, the absolute airtight legality of the timing, and the sheer, breathtaking scale of the vengeance I had just executed. He didn't ask another question. He simply picked up his pen and signed his own name on the bottom of my transfer documents, making it official. "Well, regardless of the news," Thomas said, his tone returning to a crisp, business-like cadence, "your transfers are complete. Your primary accounts are fully funded, totally secure, and completely insulated from whatever market chaos is currently happening out there." "What is the final balance of the repatriated trust?" I asked quietly. Thomas glanced at his monitor. "After all taxes, international tariffs, and fees, you are sitting on exactly $18.4 million in liquid capital. You are officially a very, very wealthy man, David." I closed my eyes, letting the number wash over me. $18 million. Miller was going to federal prison, his accounts were frozen, and the toxic real estate debt I had legally left in his lap was about to instantly bankrupt my ex-wife, leaving her personally liable for millions she could never repay. They had tried to destroy me, to leave me a broken, humiliated shell of a man. Instead, they had inadvertently handed me the keys to an empire. I stood up, grabbed my briefcase, and shook Thomas's hand one last time. I walked out of the private banking suite, took the elevator down to the lobby, and stepped back out onto the freezing, windy streets of Chicago. For the first time in years, the cold didn't bother me at all. I was entirely untouchable, completely vindicated, and absolutely free. The fallout from my orchestrated financial detonation was neither swift nor merciful for Miller and Sarah. It was a prolonged, excruciatingly public dismantling that dominated the financial news networks and local gossip circles for the better part of a year. Stepping back into the bitter, icy wind of Chicago with $18 million secured in my private trust, I felt absolutely no need to rush back to the city I used to call home. I had taken an extended leave of absence from my consulting firm, claiming the trauma of my divorce required a sabbatical. In truth, I simply wanted a front-row seat to the spectacle playing out on my laptop screen every morning from the comfort of my luxury hotel suite. Miller's arrest on live television was just the opening act. The anonymous dossier I had provided to the federal authorities was so dense with irrefutable evidence that the IRS and the SEC didn't just freeze his corporate accounts. They froze his personal assets as well. Within 48 hours of the raid, the massive, sprawling mansion he and Sarah had purchased, the very house they had proudly displayed on the cover of a local lifestyle magazine just 3 months prior, was surrounded by yellow tape and federal investigators. But the true genius of my trap didn't fully reveal itself until the secondary lawsuits began to fly. Miller's hedge fund had catered to some incredibly wealthy, highly litigious investors. When they realized their capital had been gambled away in a shadow loan Ponzi scheme, they didn't wait for the slow wheels of federal justice to grind forward. They launched a massive, coordinated civil lawsuit against Miller to recoup their losses. And because Miller, in his sheer, unadulterated arrogance during our divorce, had legally absorbed my heavily structured, toxic commercial real estate holding company to inflate his own leverage, the investors went directly after that specific asset. The covenants I had quietly embedded in that holding company triggered the absolute second Miller's primary fund lost its liquidity. The shadow debts I had cross-collateralized demanded immediate balloon payments, totaling tens of millions of dollars. Because Miller was the sole legal owner of the holding company, and because he was married to Sarah without a prenuptial agreement protecting her from his newly acquired liabilities, the furious investors set their legal crosshairs on both of them. The lawsuit was biblical in its scope. Sitting in my hotel room, drinking coffee and reading the digital court filings, I watched the arrogant, untouchable couple get systematically torn to shreds by their own hubris. Miller's high-priced corporate defense attorneys abandoned him the moment his accounts were frozen, refusing to work pro bono for a man facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Left to rely on overworked, under-resourced public defenders, Miller desperately tried to shift the blame. He claimed he was set up. He pointed a frantic, trembling finger at me, telling the investigators and the angry investors that I had deliberately engineered the toxic holding company during the divorce to ruin him. He screamed to anyone who would listen that I was the anonymous whistleblower who had sent the dossier. David did this. Miller had apparently raged during a deposition, according to a transcript leaked to the financial press. He set the trigger, he structured the debt, he tipped off the feds, you have to look at him. And they did look at me. When tens of millions of dollars are on the line, investigators leave no stone unturned. 2 weeks after the raid, I received a polite but firm request from a team of federal auditors and civil litigators to submit to a formal interview. I didn't hire a flashy defense attorney. I simply walked into the local Chicago field office dressed in a modest suit, projecting the demeanor of an exhausted, slightly bewildered man who had just spent 4 months working abroad to escape the pain of his ruined marriage. The lead investigator, a sharp-eyed man named Agent Reynolds, slid a transcript of Miller's accusations across the metal table. "Mr. Miller claims that you orchestrated his financial collapse," Reynolds said, watching my face carefully. "He alleges that you deliberately structured a commercial holding company with toxic shadow debt during your divorce proceedings and intentionally handed it to him to trigger a catastrophic margin call." Furthermore, he believes you are the anonymous source who provided the SEC with the forensic data that initiated the raid. I looked at the transcript. I didn't laugh and I didn't act defensive. I just let out a long, heavy, exhausted sigh, rubbing my temples as if the mere mention of Miller's name gave me a migraine. "Agent Reynolds," I said softly, looking him dead in the eye. "During my divorce, Mr. Miller hired 3 separate corporate law firms to audit my finances. They spent 6 months combing through every single ledger, account, and holding company I possessed. They demanded that specific commercial real estate portfolio because they believed it was highly lucrative. If there was toxic debt attached to it, his massive team of elite lawyers either missed it or they deliberately ignored it in their rush to take my assets. I am a consultant. I am not a financial mastermind capable of fooling 3 law firms and a hedge fund manager." Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "And what about the anonymous dossier?" "It was delivered electronically on the morning of April 14th at exactly 9:00 a.m. Central Standard Time. This was the moment, the exact moment the guillotine blade dropped on Miller's last, desperate defense. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a perfectly organized manila folder, and slid it across the metal table toward the agent. "I have absolutely no idea what happened on the morning of April 14th, I told him, keeping my voice utterly calm and deeply sincere. I was too exhausted to care about the news. I had just landed at O'Hare after a 20-hour, 3-leg flight from Singapore. The time-stamped airline manifests and customs declarations are in that folder." I pointed to the documents as Reynolds opened the folder. "Furthermore," I continued, "at the exact moment Mr. Miller alleges I was coordinating this massive, anonymous cyber delivery and executing complex financial triggers. I was checking into the Sheraton suites, working out in their 3rd-floor fitness center, and then eating a very large plate of pancakes in the hotel restaurant." I tapped the glass table directly above the final piece of paper in the stack. It was the original merchant receipt from the hotel restaurant, clearly showing my signature and the printed timestamp. "April 14th, 10:14 a.m. I was eating breakfast, Agent Reynolds. I didn't even have my laptop open. The hotel lobby cameras and the gym keycard logs, which you are more than welcome to subpoena, will verify every single second of my morning." Reynolds stared at the receipt, then at the customs declarations, and finally looked back up at me. He was an experienced federal agent. He knew when a man was lying, and he knew when an alibi was too perfect to break. My paper trail was a titanium wall. There was no digital footprint linking me to the anonymous dossier, and there was irrefutable physical proof that I was nowhere near a computer when the trap was sprung. "Mr. Miller," Reynolds sighed, closing the manila folder, "is a desperate man facing a long prison sentence. Desperate men tend to point fingers at anyone they can. I appreciate your cooperation, David. You are free to go." I walked out of the federal building with the absolute certainty that I would never be questioned about Miller again. Without me as a scapegoat, Miller and Sarah bore the full, unmitigated brunt of the legal catastrophe. The civil lawsuits completely bankrupted them. The courts ordered the immediate liquidation of all their shared assets. The sprawling mansion was sold at auction. The luxury cars were repossessed. Sarah's diamond rings and designer wardrobes were seized to pay down the massive balloon payments on the holding company they had so arrogantly stolen from me. Sarah tried to file for divorce from Miller, desperately attempting to distance herself from his radioactive liabilities, but it was far too late. She had married him without a prenuptial agreement, eagerly tying her financial future to his. She was legally bound to the wreckage. I sat in my luxury hotel suite in Chicago, entirely insulated by my repatriated $18 million, and watched the woman who had coldly destroyed our family lose absolutely everything. The scales of justice hadn't just been balanced, they had been entirely shattered. The unseen lawsuit had done its job flawlessly, and I had emerged from the fire completely untouched. For all the meticulous planning and the sheer, breathtaking scale of the destruction I had unleashed upon Miller and Sarah, there was one detail I had kept entirely to myself. It wasn't something I discussed with Thomas Sterling at J.P. Morgan, and it certainly wasn't something I ever brought up to the federal investigators who fruitlessly attempted to pin the whistleblower title on me. To fully understand how I had managed to penetrate the digital fortress of Miller's hedge fund from a corporate apartment in Singapore, you had to understand that I hadn't acted entirely alone. While my ex-wife and her new husband were busy parading their wealth across the Chicago social scene, I had spent the first few months of my Singapore assignment combing through public records, looking for a weak link in Miller's armor. I knew that a man as arrogant and sociopathic as Miller didn't build an empire without leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. I just needed to find a body that was still breathing, someone who hated him as much as I did, but who possessed the internal access I lacked. I found her in the fine print of a dismissed wrongful termination lawsuit. Her name was Alina. 2 years prior to my divorce, Alina had been one of the brightest senior compliance analysts at Miller's hedge fund. She was a woman who lived by the rigid laws of corporate ethics, and when she inevitably stumbled across the initial architecture of his Shadowlone Ponzi scheme, she did what any ethical analyst would do. She drafted a memo to the board of directors. Miller's response was swift and merciless. He didn't just fire her, he completely destroyed her professional reputation. He utilized his massive legal team to bury her in non-disclosure agreements, threatened her with devastating countersuits, and actively blacklisted her across the entire Chicago financial district. A brilliant, principled woman was systematically reduced to working as a mid-level bookkeeper at a local auto dealership, her career entirely derailed by a man who couldn't stand the sight of his own reflection. Finding her hadn't been easy, and approaching her had been even harder. But grief and righteous anger are a universal language. When I first contacted her through a highly encrypted channel, she was terrified. She knew the extent of Miller's vindictiveness. But as I laid out my plan, as I showed her the sheer, undeniable scope of the financial guillotine I was building, the terror slowly gave way to a cold, focused determination. Alina was the ghost in the machine. She knew exactly where the bodies were buried in Miller's servers because she was the one who had initially tried to exhume them. Over the course of 3 months, while I funded her efforts and provided the secure, offshore digital infrastructure, she quietly, methodically pulled the raw data that formed the foundation of the anonymous dossier. We never met in person. We never spoke on the phone. We communicated entirely through encrypted, single-use digital drops, ensuring that our connection was absolutely untraceable. Now, with Miller's life reduced to a smoldering crater of federal indictments and civil bankruptcies, it was time to close the ledger on our quiet partnership. I had been back in Chicago for nearly 3 weeks, my leave of absence from the consulting firm stretching into a comfortable, indefinite sabbatical. The city had completely thawed from the bitter grip of April, the trees in Millennium Park bursting with vibrant, bright green leaves. It was a beautiful Friday afternoon, and I was sitting at a small, unassuming cafe in the West Loop, wearing casual slacks and a light sweater. I had arranged the meeting using our final encrypted channel. I ordered an iced coffee and waited watching the bustling foot traffic on the sidewalk outside. At exactly 2:00 p.m., the bell above the cafe door chimed. A woman walked in, scanning the room. I recognized her immediately from the few photographs I had found during my initial research, though she looked older, carrying the quiet, heavy grace of someone who had survived a profound injustice. She spotted me sitting in the back corner and walked over. "David," she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Alina," I replied, standing up to pull out the chair across from me. "Please sit down. Can I get you anything?" "No, thank you," she said, taking the seat. She placed a small, worn leather purse on the table and looked at me. For a long moment, neither of us said a word. We just looked at each other, two strangers bound together by a shared trauma and a brilliantly executed vengeance. "I saw the news this morning," Alina finally said, a small, tight smile playing on her lips. The federal prosecutors officially denied his bail request. They consider him an extreme flight risk given the offshore accounts. He's going to be sitting in a holding cell until the trial. "And the civil suits?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The investors successfully petitioned the court to liquidate the primary residential estate," she nodded. "His wife, your ex-wife, was officially evicted on Tuesday. I heard she's currently staying in a budget motel near O'Hare while she tries to find a lawyer who will represent her for free. She won't find one." The confirmation of Sarah's absolute destitution didn't bring me joy, but it brought me a profound, centering peace. The universe had balanced the scales. "You did incredible work, Alina," I told her, my voice thick with genuine respect. "The dossier was flawless. The federal agents didn't even have to dig. You handed them a fully excavated grave." "I just provided the map, David," she replied, shaking her head slightly. "You built the bomb. The way you structured that commercial real estate holding company to trigger the margin calls, it was terrifyingly brilliant. You didn't just expose him, you ensured that the collateral damage fell exactly where it belonged." I reached into the breast pocket of my sweater and pulled out a thick, sealed, unmarked envelope. I placed it gently onto the table and slid it across the polished wood toward her. Elena looked down at the envelope, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is this?" "When you agreed to help me," I explained quietly, "I promised you that I would ensure your efforts were compensated. The funds inside this envelope are drawn from a completely secure, untraceable offshore trust. It is completely clean. It has absolutely no digital ties to me, to Miller, or to the hedge fund." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the envelope. "David, I didn't do this for the money. I did this because that man destroyed my life, and I wanted to see him face justice." "I know," I smiled softly. "But justice doesn't pay the rent, Elena, and it certainly doesn't replace the career he stole from you." She picked up the envelope and opened the flap. I watched her eyes widen as she took in the cashier's check inside. It wasn't a small token of appreciation. It was a substantial sum, enough to pay off a mortgage, start a new business, and comfortably rebuild the life she had lost. "David, this is—" She stammered, looking back up at me with tears springing to her eyes. "This is too much." "It's exactly what you deserve," I insisted, my voice firm. "You risked everything to help a complete stranger. You gave me the keys to my own freedom. Take the money, Elena, start fresh. Build something beautiful with it." A tear escaped, tracking slowly down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She simply looked at me, a profound, overwhelming gratitude radiating from her expression. The heavy, burdened posture she had carried into the cafe seemed to evaporate instantly, replaced by the light, buoyant energy of a woman who had finally been set free from her own private prison. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You didn't just take him down, David. You gave me a good start. You gave me my life back." "We gave each other our lives back," I corrected her gently. We sat in the cafe for another half hour, the conversation shifting away from the darkness of Miller and the wreckage of the past. We talked about the future. Elena revealed that she had always wanted to open her own independent, ethical financial consulting firm for small businesses, and the funds I had provided were going to make that dream an immediate reality. When it was finally time to leave, we stood up and shook hands. It was a firm, grounding handshake between two survivors who had walked through the fire and emerged entirely victorious. "Take care of yourself, David," Elena smiled, holding her purse tightly against her side. "You too, Elena. Enjoy the rest of your life." I watched her walk out of the cafe and disappear into the bustling crowds of the West Loop. As I turned to leave, leaving a generous tip on the table, I felt a deep, resonant closure settle over my soul. The final thread of the operation had been neatly tied off. There were no loose ends, no lingering guilt, and no uncompensated allies. The ledger was entirely, flawlessly balanced. I walked out into the bright Chicago afternoon, the spring sun warm against my face. I had $18 million in the bank, absolute legal immunity, and an entire lifetime stretching out before me, unburdened by the treacherous weight of my past. The tragedy of my divorce was officially over. It was time to close the book on vengeance and finally start writing the next chapter of my life. There is a distinct, almost clinical fascination in watching an empire collapse from a safe, untouchable distance. In the movies, revenge is often portrayed as a fiery, chaotic, and physically violent affair, culminating in a dramatic confrontation. But in the real world, the world governed by contracts, leveraged assets, and high society reputations, true destruction is entirely silent. It happens in courtrooms, in frozen bank accounts, and in the sudden, deafening quiet of a ringing phone that no one bothers to answer anymore. By the time autumn rolled into Chicago, painting the trees in the affluent suburbs with brilliant shades of amber and gold, the spectacle of the Miller scandal had transitioned from breaking news to a finalized, devastating reality. I was sitting in the quiet, mahogany-paneled reading room of an exclusive, invite-only private club in the Loop, a membership I had casually purchased with a fraction of my newly repatriated $18 million. I had a glass of aged single malt scotch resting on the table beside me and a pristine view of the city skyline. I was officially a spectator to the final act of their ruin. Miller's absolute financial bankruptcy had been swift, but his social annihilation was a prolonged, agonizing masterpiece. The elite circles of Chicago high society are incredibly insular and fiercely protective of their own status. They will happily tolerate arrogance, and they will even turn a blind eye to infidelity, but they have absolutely zero tolerance for a man who loses their money. When the federal indictments came down and the civil suits revealed that Miller had gambled away the fortunes of his closest friends and investors, the social excommunication was instantaneous and absolute. Through the wealthy grapevine of the financial district, I heard the stories. Miller's prestigious country club membership, which he had so proudly flaunted in my face during the divorce proceedings, was unilaterally revoked. The wealthy socialites who had eagerly clinked champagne glasses with Sarah at charity galas suddenly didn't know who she was. When Sarah attempted to walk into her favorite high-end boutique on the Magnificent Mile, hoping to leverage her past status for a line of credit, the manager politely but firmly asked her to leave the premises. They had built their entire identity on the illusion of superiority, and without the foundation of stolen wealth to prop it up, they simply ceased to exist in the world they loved so much. The true gravity of Sarah's desperation became undeniably clear on a rainy Tuesday evening in early November. I was sitting in my luxury apartment reviewing a portfolio of potential new investments when my cell phone vibrated. It wasn't a call, it was a notification from my email. I had changed my primary phone number and blocked all of her known contacts months ago, but she had somehow managed to find an old, secondary email address I rarely checked. The subject line was blank. I opened the email. The message was long, chaotic, and drenched in a pathetic, theatrical desperation. "David," she wrote. "I know you probably hate me right now, and I don't blame you, but please, I am begging you to just read this. Everything is gone. The feds took the house, the cars, even the jewelry from my grandmother. I am living in a terrible one-bedroom apartment near the airport, and I don't even have enough money to pay the heating bill next month. Miller lied to me. He manipulated me, David. He made me think our marriage was broken, and he blinded me with promises he couldn't keep. I was so stupid. I miss our life. I miss the safety of what we had. I know you got a large severance or something when you quit the consulting firm. Please, if you ever loved me, if you care about the mother of your children at all, just help me get back on my feet. Just a small loan to help me secure a lawyer. I have nowhere else to turn." I sat back in my leather chair and read the email a second time. A year ago, a message like this from Sarah would have sent my heart into a frantic, agonizing tailspin. A year ago, I was a broken man, sitting in a sterile hotel room in Singapore, bleeding out from the emotional wounds she had so callously inflicted. She was banking on that version of me. She was throwing a desperate lifeline into the dark, hoping to hook the pathetic, endlessly forgiving husband she had discarded. She was hoping to use my empathy as her final emergency parachute. Miller manipulated me. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of the lie was almost impressive. No one had forced Sarah to sign the divorce papers. No one had forced her to smirk across the mediation table as her lawyers actively tried to bankrupt me. She hadn't been manipulated. She had made a calculated, predatory bet on a shinier asset, and the asset had violently depreciated. I sat in the quiet of my apartment and waited for the anger to rise. I waited for the bitter sting of betrayal, or perhaps a flicker of vindictive joy. But as I stared at her digital plea for salvation, I realized something profoundly liberating. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional ledger was completely zeroed out. The woman who had written this email wasn't my wife. She was simply a bankrupt liability tied to a defunct corporate entity I no longer recognized. I didn't type out a furious, gloating reply. I didn't take the opportunity to rub my $18 million in her face or brag about how I was the one who had pulled the floor out from under her. I simply moved my cursor over the trash icon and clicked delete. I permanently blocked the email address, closed my laptop, and went to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. I never heard from her again. Later that night, as the city lights flickered to life outside my window, I found myself wrestling with a deep, philosophical question. It was a question that had lingered in the back of my mind since the morning I handed Thomas Sterling the signed divestiture forms at J.P. Morgan. Was I a monster? I had systematically, coldly orchestrated the total destruction of two human beings. I had mapped out their ruin with the precise, sociopathic calculation of a predator. I had weaponized the legal system, manipulated the financial markets, and smiled politely at federal agents while holding the smoking gun behind my back. In any conventional moral framework, my actions were deeply, ruthlessly vindictive. But as I looked out over the Chicago skyline, I realized the absolute truth of the situation. I hadn't forged a single document. I hadn't hacked a server, planted false evidence, or committed perjury. I hadn't forced Miller to run a highly illegal, shadow loan Ponzi scheme, and I certainly hadn't forced him to absorb my holding company in a blind rush of corporate greed. I had simply turned on the lights in a room full of cockroaches. I had handed a deeply corrupt man a loaded gun, fully aware of his arrogance, and allowed him to pull the trigger himself. My vengeance was complete, and against all odds, it was entirely justified. It had played out perfectly, like a meticulously plotted saga where the villain is consumed by his own insatiable appetite. I had learned dark, complex lessons in the mechanics of revenge, executing them in ways I never dreamed possible when I was just a mild-mannered financial consultant. The trauma of the divorce had burned away my naivety, forging me into someone harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. The ashes of my old life had completely settled. The Millers were a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of the financial district, their legacy reduced to federal court dockets and empty bank accounts. Meanwhile, my own horizons were expanding at an unprecedented rate. Financially, I was in a position of staggering, unshakable power. The tragedy was officially over, and the stage was finally cleared for the empire I was about to build. When you spend the better part of a year meticulously plotting the absolute destruction of your enemies, dedicating every waking moment and every ounce of your intellect to a singular, ruinous goal, the sudden absence of that mission leaves behind a staggering psychological vacuum. By the time the first snow of December began to dust the sidewalks of downtown Chicago, the Miller saga had effectively concluded. They were erased, bankrupt, and entirely irrelevant to my existence. But as I sat in my luxury apartment, staring at the $18 million resting comfortably in my private trust, I realized that I was faced with a highly complex problem. What does a man do when he has successfully avenged his past, secured enough wealth to never work another day in his life, and yet feels completely unable to sit still? Most men in my position would have bought a villa in the Caribbean, purchased a yacht, and spent the rest of their days fading into a sun-drenched, rum-soaked retirement. But I found the idea of a quiet retirement entirely repulsive. The brutal, scorched-earth divorce from Sarah had fundamentally rewired my psychological circuitry. I had been stripped of my power, humiliated in a courtroom, and treated as a disposable stepping stone. The $18 million didn't represent an endpoint to me. It represented impenetrable armor. It was seed capital. I didn't want to retire to a beach. I wanted to conquer the very financial district that Miller had once terrorized. I ended my sabbatical just after the new year and returned to the downtown offices of Sterling and Hayes, the boutique financial consulting firm where I had worked for the last decade. The firm was founded 30 years ago by George Hayes, an old-school, fiercely intelligent financial veteran who had mentored me since I was a junior analyst. George was in his late 60s now. He was a brilliant man, but the relentless, high-speed evolution of modern global finance was clearly beginning to exhaust him. The dark circles under his eyes had grown permanent, and his once booming voice in the boardroom had softened into a weary rasp. He was tired of the grind, tired of the aggressive new generation of corporate sharks, and tired of carrying the weight of a firm that employed over 50 people. When I walked back into the office on a crisp Monday morning, George expected the same quiet, reliable, mildly traumatized David who had fled to Singapore 9 months prior. Instead, he got a completely different man. The trauma of the divorce and the subsequent execution of my revenge had burned away every last trace of my professional complacency. I was no longer the accommodating consultant who simply balanced ledgers and offered polite advice. I was sharp, ruthless, and entirely immune to intimidation. Because I had $18 million secretly anchoring my life, I no longer operated from a place of fear. I didn't need the salary. I didn't need the bonuses. And because I didn't need them, I was suddenly capable of taking massive, calculated risks that terrified my colleagues. Within my first month back, I completely restructured our international tax division, unceremoniously firing 2 underperforming junior partners and personally taking over their portfolios. I began walking into negotiations with the cold, dead-eyed precision of a forensic surgeon. I remember a specific meeting in late February. We were representing a mid-sized tech logistics firm that was facing a hostile, incredibly aggressive buyout attempt from a massive venture capital conglomerate. The opposing lawyers swaggered into our boardroom, slapping a lowball term sheet on the table, clearly expecting us to fall. Before George could even offer a diplomatic counteroffer, I slid the term sheet back across the glass table. I proceeded to verbally dissect the conglomerate's lead negotiator, citing specific, deeply buried vulnerabilities in their own supply chain infrastructure that I had uncovered the night before. I looked the man dead in the eye and calmly explained that if they didn't raise their valuation by 40%, I would personally advise my client to leak the conglomerate's internal deficits to the financial press, effectively tanking their quarterly stock price. The room went dead silent. George stared at me, his jaw slightly slack. The opposing lawyers blustered and threatened, but I didn't blink. I didn't even raise my voice. I just sat there, projecting absolute, terrifying certainty. 2 days later, they accepted our terms, resulting in the largest single consulting commission our firm had secured in a decade. George watched this transformation with a mixture of profound awe and subtle apprehension. He knew about my divorce, of course. He knew that I had been dragged through the mud, but he had absolutely no idea about the $18 million, nor my hidden role in the collapse of the Miller empire. All he saw was a man who had walked through a psychological fire and emerged as a titan of industry. As my reputation in the Chicago financial district skyrocketed, our firm's revenue followed suit. We were landing accounts that had previously been entirely out of our league. I was working long hours, but it wasn't the desperate, numbing grind I had used to survive my heartbreak in Singapore. It was a purposeful, exhilarating ascension. In late March, exactly 1 year after I had initiated my revenge, George invited me to dinner. He didn't suggest a quick drink near the office. He booked a private, leather-upholstered booth at an old-school, legendary steakhouse on Rush Street. It was the kind of restaurant where deals were made in hushed tones over expensive scotch, where the waiters wore white tuxedos, and the air smelled heavily of charred bone-in ribeyes and cigar smoke. I arrived early, ordered a glass of heavy Cabernet, and waited. George walked in 10 minutes later, looking particularly exhausted, leaning heavily on his umbrella as he navigated the dimly lit dining room. "David," he sighed, sliding into the booth across from me. "Thank you for joining me. I know your schedule has been completely manic lately." "It's a good kind of manic, George," I smiled, raising my glass. "We're up 22% for the quarter. The logistics merger went through flawlessly, and we just secured the retaining contract for the entire regional hospital network." George ordered a bourbon straight up and looked at me for a long time before speaking. "You've been incredible since you came back from Singapore," George said, his voice quiet and reflective. "I don't know what happened to you over there. I know the divorce nearly broke you, but whatever you found in Southeast Asia, it turned you into the best consultant this city has seen in 20 years. You have a killer instinct now, David, but it's an ethical one. You don't break the law, but you don't let anyone breathe in the room without your permission." "I just stopped being afraid of losing," I replied simply. "When you lose everything you thought mattered, you realize the game is entirely psychological. I'm just playing the game." "Well, you're playing it better than I ever did," George chuckled dryly, taking a sip of his bourbon. He set the glass down and folded his hands on the heavy white tablecloth. The casual, complimentary tone vanished, replaced by the serious weight of a business proposition. "I'm 68 years old, David," George said, looking suddenly very fragile. "My wife wants to move to our house in Naples. My doctor is telling me my blood pressure is a ticking time bomb. I am tired. I don't want to review another quarterly prospectus as long as I live. I want out." I remained perfectly still, letting him speak. "I own 60% of Sterling and Hayes," he continued. "It's my life's work. I won't sell it to a massive conglomerate that will strip it down for parts and fire the staff. I want the legacy protected. I want to sell my controlling stake to you, David. I want you to take over as the undisputed head of the firm." He held up a hand before I could answer, clearly anticipating a refusal based on logistics. Now, I know a buyout of this magnitude is daunting. The firm's valuation is substantial. I am perfectly willing to structure a seller-financed loan. We can draw up a 10-year payment plan, take it out of your future executive dividends, and find some quiet private equity backers to float the initial. "What is the number, George?" I interrupted smoothly, my voice calm. George blinked, slightly derailed by the directness of the question. "Our internal auditors ran the numbers last week, given our recent spike in revenue. My 60% stake is valued at exactly $12.5 million. He looked at me sympathetically, expecting me to wince at the massive 8-figure price tag. To a salaried financial consultant, $12.5 million is a mountain that requires a lifetime of climbing and a small army of corporate bankers to scale. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet. I let the rich, complex flavor linger on my tongue for a moment before setting the crystal glass back down on the white linen tablecloth. "I don't want to deal with private equity backers, George," I said evenly. "They complicate the boardroom. and they demand quarterly returns that suffocate long-term growth. And I certainly don't want to spend the next 10 years funneling my dividends into a seller-financed loan. George's face fell slightly, disappointment clouding his tired eyes. He clearly thought I was rejecting the offer because the financial hurdle was simply too high. David, I understand it's a massive burden, but I wouldn't offer it if I didn't think you could. I will buy your 60% stake for the full $12.5 million, I stated, leaning forward slightly, locking eyes with my mentor. And I will do it in cash, a direct wire transfer. We can close the deal in 30 days. The silence that fell over the booth was absolute. The background noise of the steakhouse, the clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, the soft jazz playing over the speakers seemed to fade entirely away. George sat frozen, his hand still resting near his bourbon glass. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He stared at me with an expression of sheer, unadulterated shock, as if I had just casually informed him that I possessed the ability to levitate. David. George finally stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He looked around the booth, instinctively checking to see if anyone was listening before leaning in closer. How? How in God's name does a senior consultant have $12.5 million in liquid cash? That is impossible, unless you. During my time in Singapore, I said, offering him the exact same polite, impenetrable smile I had given the federal investigators months ago, I made a series of highly successful private offshore investments. I took some calculated risks, and the market was incredibly generous. I assure you, George, the capital is completely clean, fully repatriated, and sitting in a private trust at J.P. Morgan. I can have the proof of funds sent to your attorneys by tomorrow morning. George stared at me for another long, heavy minute. He was a veteran of the financial world. He knew that private offshore investments was a polite euphemism for maneuvers that were legally sound but aggressively complex. He thought of the man who had torn apart the venture capitalists in the boardroom. He realized in that moment that he didn't really know the man sitting across from him at all. He didn't know the depths of my resources, and he didn't know the extent of my capabilities. But he knew I would protect his firm, and he knew his retirement was suddenly, miraculously secured. A slow, massive smile broke across George's tired face. He reached across the table and extended his hand. "I'll have my lawyers draft the contracts tomorrow," George said, his voice thick with relief and newfound respect. I reached out and shook his hand firmly, sealing the deal. The transition was seamless. Within 6 weeks, the ink was dry. The $12.5 million was wired directly from my trust to George's accounts, leaving me with a very comfortable $6 million in reserve. George retired to Florida, and I moved into his massive corner office. I redesigned the space, stripping away the dark, heavy mahogany and replacing it with sleek, modern glass and steel. The firm was officially rebranded, with my name sitting at the very top of the letterhead. I had walked out of a divorce courtroom 2 years ago feeling like a hollowed-out victim, completely stripped of my dignity and my life's savings. Now I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of my own corporate empire, looking down at the sprawling, intricate grid of the Chicago financial district. I owned it. I controlled it. And the most beautiful, satisfying part of the entire ascent was that the people who had tried to destroy me were entirely absent, lost to the consequences of their own arrogance, while I had quietly, ruthlessly claimed the absolute summit. Success is a magnificent insulator, but it rarely functions as a complete eraser. The $12.5 million wire transfer to George had secured my corporate kingdom, but it also fundamentally shifted the atmosphere of my daily life. I was no longer David, the diligent senior consultant. I was David Hayes, the sole proprietor of a fiercely profitable boutique financial firm. The corner office was mine, the high-stakes decisions were mine, and the crushing, exhilarating pressure of maintaining the empire rested squarely on my shoulders. I thrived under that pressure. The business expanded steadily, acquiring a reputation for ruthless efficiency and impenetrable ethical standards. Yet, as the years began to blur into a comfortable, wealthy routine, the ghosts of the old life occasionally drifted through the reinforced walls of my new existence. My children, Liam and Chloe, were the primary tether to my past. During the agonizing, prolonged divorce, Miller and Sarah had actively attempted to alienate me from them. They had leveraged their newfound wealth, the sports cars, the lavish vacations, the endless stream of expensive gifts, to paint me as the boring, absent father who had failed to provide. For a long time, it had worked. My weekends with the kids had been strained, filled with monosyllabic answers and clearly forced interactions. But teenagers, for all their supposed angst and susceptibility to shiny objects, possess a deeply ingrained, almost feral radar for authenticity. When Miller's empire spectacularly detonated, the facade of Sarah's glamorous life vanished overnight. The sports cars were repossessed. The sprawling mansion was padlocked by federal marshals. The fun, rich stepdad was unceremoniously hauled away in handcuffs, his face splashed across the evening news as a high-profile corporate fraudster. The immediate fallout for Liam and Chloe was undoubtedly chaotic. They were forced to uproot their lives, leaving their affluent high school district and moving into a cramped, noisy apartment near O'Hare with a mother who was suddenly consumed by panic and overwhelming debt. But surprisingly, the crisis didn't push them further away from me. It acted as a harsh, necessary corrective lens. Without the blinding glare of Miller's money, my children finally saw the reality of the board. They saw a mother whose priorities had been wildly misplaced, and they saw a father who, despite being dragged through absolute hell, had remained quietly, immovably steadfast. Our relationship didn't heal overnight with a dramatic, tearful reconciliation. It was a slow, gradual thawing process. Liam, who was heavily invested in varsity baseball, started calling me more often, asking for advice on his swing or complaining about his coach. Chloe, fiercely academic and intensely private, began sending me drafts of her college admission essays, seeking the analytical critique she knew her mother couldn't provide. I made a deliberate, conscious decision never to speak ill of Sarah in front of them. The universe had already delivered a punishment far more devastating than anything I could say. I didn't gloat about my wealth, and I certainly didn't use it to buy their affection the way Miller had attempted to. I simply provided consistency. When they needed a reliable car to drive to practice, I bought them safe, practical sedans. When the tuition bills for their respective state universities arrived, I paid them quietly and in full from the firm's private accounts. To them, I was just dad. The reliable, slightly intense financial consultant who worked too much but always picked up the phone. They viewed their mother with a mixture of exasperated affection and necessary distance, recognizing her for the flawed, deeply flawed human she was. In the end, the children adapted exactly the way teenagers are biologically designed to. They focused entirely on their own lives, their friends, and their futures, pushing their parents firmly into the background. To Liam and Chloe, Sarah and I simply became the necessary infrastructure of their existence, handy ATMs, occasional chauffeurs, and reliable safety nets. It wasn't a perfect Hallmark movie family dynamic, but it was healthy, functional, and devoid of toxic manipulation. As the kids moved away to college and began forging their own paths, my contact with Sarah dwindled to absolute zero. Through the unavoidable, gossipy channels of old mutual acquaintances, I occasionally caught fragments of her trajectory. The first few years after the bankruptcy had been profoundly humiliating for her. She had been forced to work a series of entry-level retail jobs just to keep the lights on in her cramped apartment, a staggering fall from the country club patios she had briefly occupied. About 4 years after the federal raid, the whispers indicated that Sarah had finally found a lifeline. She had begun dating an older man, a retired, moderately successful logistics manager who had long ago settled into a quiet, uncomplicated life in the suburbs. He wasn't a billionaire hedge fund manager, but he possessed the one thing Sarah desperately needed: stability. They dated for a few years, eventually moved in together, and quietly married in a small, unpublicized ceremony. Liam and Chloe attended the wedding. When they returned, I didn't interrogate them. I simply asked if it was a nice event. "It was fine," Liam shrugged, grabbing a bottle of water from my kitchen fridge. "He seems like a nice enough guy, quiet, likes golf. Mom seems settled." "Settled is good," I replied honestly, and I meant it. I felt absolutely no resentment toward the older man, nor any lingering anger toward Sarah. Her new life was utterly irrelevant to my own. She was a closed ledger, a finalized transaction that had yielded an incredibly high return on a deeply painful initial investment. But as my professional life soared and my children flourished, the massive, silent void in my personal life became increasingly difficult to ignore. I was a wealthy, healthy, deeply successful man in my mid-40s. By all societal metrics, I should have been an incredibly eligible bachelor, actively navigating the Chicago dating scene or leveraging my status to find a new partner. The reality, however, was starkly different. I was entirely, resolutely single. I had no fantasy of a new romance. I didn't download dating apps. I politely declined every setup attempt orchestrated by well-meaning friends, and I kept my interactions with women strictly confined to professional boardrooms or casual platonic coffee meetings. The truth, which I rarely admitted even to myself, was that the psychological armor I had forged to survive the divorce had hardened into a permanent exoskeleton. Sarah's betrayal hadn't just broken my heart, it had fundamentally shattered my capacity to trust. I viewed relationships through the cold, cynical lens of a corporate risk assessment. I saw potential partners not as companions, but as massive, unpredictable liabilities. If the woman I had built a life with, the woman who had mothered my children, was capable of discarding me so callously for a shinier asset, how could I ever possibly trust someone new? My wealth, which I continued to guard with paranoid secrecy in my personal life, only compounded the issue. I knew that if I brought a woman into my world, I would spend every waking moment internally auditing her motives. Was she laughing at my joke because I was genuinely funny, or because she knew I owned the firm? Was she interested in David the man, or David the multi-million-dollar safety net? The paranoia was exhausting. So I simply opted out of the game entirely. I poured my entire existence into Sterling and Hayes. The firm became my surrogate spouse. I nurtured it, protected it, and watched it grow with a fierce, unwavering devotion. I took long, solitary vacations to remote, beautiful locations, hiking the Swiss Alps, reading on quiet beaches in Costa Rica, and exploring the ancient streets of Kyoto, but I always went alone. I convinced myself that my solitude was a choice, a luxurious byproduct of my extreme independence. But the people who truly loved me could see through the polished, corporate facade. My father, a retired structural engineer who possessed a quiet, unshakable wisdom, had watched my post-divorce evolution with growing concern. He was incredibly proud of my financial success and the way I had reestablished my relationship with Liam and Chloe. But he was also a man who understood the profound, destructive nature of suppressed trauma. We were having dinner at his modest home in the suburbs one Sunday evening, 6 years after the finalization of the divorce. I was telling him about a particularly aggressive corporate acquisition I had just successfully negotiated. "You're a brilliant man, David," my father said, setting his fork down and looking at me across the small dining table. His eyes were kind but heavily layered with concern. "You built an empire out of absolute ashes. I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become professionally." "Thank you, Dad," I smiled, taking a sip of my wine. "But you're hiding, son," he continued softly, the statement hanging heavy in the quiet room. I frowned, immediately defensive. "I'm not hiding. I run a massive firm. I travel the world. I'm incredibly active." "You're hiding in plain sight," my father corrected me gently. "You built a fortress to keep the monsters out, and it worked. Miller is gone. Sarah is gone. The threat has been completely neutralized. But you forgot to put a door on the fortress, David. You've locked yourself inside. You are punishing your own future for the sins of your past." I looked down at my plate, the defensive arguments dying in my throat. He was right. He was entirely, devastatingly right. "You won the war, David," my father said, reaching across the table to cover my hand with his own rough, calloused palm. "But the war is over. It's time to put the armor down. You need to talk to someone, a professional. You need to figure out how to be a human being again, not just a CEO." I sat in the quiet of my childhood home, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. I had spent 6 years calculating ledgers, executing vengeance, and building wealth. I had mastered the mechanics of survival. But as I looked at my father, I finally admitted the one terrifying truth I had been running from. I had absolutely no idea how to heal. It is a remarkably humbling experience to realize that you can orchestrate the multi-million-dollar downfall of a corrupt hedge fund manager, acquire a prestigious consulting firm in a single cash transaction, and completely master the global financial markets, yet still be entirely terrified of sitting on a beige linen couch in a therapist's office. But 2 weeks after that sobering dinner with my father, that is exactly where I found myself. I hired Dr. Aris, a highly recommended trauma specialist who worked out of a quiet, discreet office building in the Gold Coast neighborhood. During our first session, I treated the appointment exactly like a corporate audit. I walked in, handed him a brief, bullet-pointed verbal summary of my divorce, the betrayal, and the subsequent market adjustments I had executed, and essentially asked him for a timeline on my emotional recovery. Dr. Aris, a calm man with kind eyes and infinite patience, just smiled, set his notepad down, and said, "David, you are treating your heart like a distressed asset. We aren't here to balance a ledger. We are here to dismantle the bomb shelter you built around your life." The process was grueling. In many ways, it was far more difficult than navigating the cutthroat corporate boardrooms I dominated every day. For 6 years, I had successfully used my anger, my wealth, and my fierce independence as a shield. I had convinced myself that I was invincible because I didn't need anyone. But over months of intense, honest therapy, Dr. Aris helped me unravel the knot of my own paranoia. He helped me see that Sarah's betrayal was never a reflection of my worth as a husband or a man. She was a woman drawn to superficial, shiny things, and she had simply gravitated toward a man who possessed the same hollow, transactional soul she did. Her actions were entirely about her own deficits, not mine. More importantly, Dr. Aris forced me to confront the reality of my $18 million. He helped me realize that while my wealth was an incredible tool, one that had secured my independence and protected my children's futures, it could not be used as an excuse to avoid human connection. If I spent the rest of my life auditing the motives of every person I met, I was essentially doing Miller's job for him. I was keeping myself in a prison of my own making. Slowly, deliberately, I began to open the door to my fortress. I started small. I accepted invitations to casual dinners with colleagues without analyzing their networking motives. I joined a local cycling club that met on Saturday mornings, intentionally introducing myself just as David, leaving the CEO title and the bespoke suits at home. And eventually, I started dating again. I didn't rush into anything heavy, and I certainly didn't flash my black card to impress anyone. I went on simple coffee dates. I went to art galleries and bookstores. I allowed myself to be vulnerable, to laugh genuinely, and to experience the terrifying, beautiful thrill of getting to know someone without a spreadsheet or a background check. I'm still a work in progress. Healing is not a linear, upward trajectory. It is a complex, daily choice to remain open to the world. But as I stand in my glass-paneled corner office today, looking out over the sprawling, magnificent Chicago skyline, the dark, heavy storm clouds of my past have entirely cleared. I won the war against the people who tried to destroy me. But the greatest victory of my life wasn't watching Miller get hauled away in handcuffs, and it wasn't the wire transfer that made me a multimillionaire. My greatest victory was looking at the ashes of my old life, realizing I had survived the fire, and choosing to finally step out of the armor and live again. A valuable lesson for the listener. If there is one profound, echoing truth to take away from David's story, it is this. Revenge may balance the scales of justice, but it will never heal a broken heart. When we are deeply betrayed by the people we love and trust the most, our immediate primal instinct is to seek vindication. We want the people who hurt us to feel the exact magnitude of the pain they inflicted. David achieved a flawless, cinematic vengeance. He expertly turned the greed and arrogance of his abusers against them, securing his own financial empire while watching them plummet into ruin. It is incredibly satisfying to see toxic, manipulative people face the absolute consequences of their own actions. But as David discovered, survival is not the same thing as living. You can build the thickest, most impenetrable walls around yourself. You can achieve massive professional success and accumulate endless wealth to ensure no one can ever take advantage of you again. But if you allow the trauma of your past to permanently dictate your future, you are giving your abusers a lingering, lifelong power over your happiness. The ultimate revenge against those who try to destroy you is not just their downfall. It is your own spectacular, unapologetic recovery. It is doing the hard, quiet work of therapy. It is finding the courage to trust again. It is refusing to let the actions of a few hollow, greedy individuals extinguish your capacity for genuine love and human connection. Protect your peace, set your boundaries, and never allow anyone to exploit you. But once the war is won, remember to put down your armor. You deserve to experience the beauty of the world, not just watch it from behind the walls of a fortress. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. Have you ever struggled to drop your armor and trust again after a major betrayal? How did you begin your own healing process? Let me know your thoughts and your stories in the comments below. If you found David's journey as compelling and thought-provoking as I did, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story. Until next time, protect your peace, do the hard work to heal, and take care of yourselves.